Hey peeps, welcome to another video. Today it is part 2 in the McCalls 7634 sew along, and today I will be talking you through making the top. So let's get started. So we're moving on to the top now. I am doing things out of order because this is me we're talking about. So the very first thing that I've done is interfaced my front band pieces with stretch interfacing, and then I've also marked on where my eyelets need to go. Now I have done that with an air erasable pen, so it just disappears over time. So I think I'm actually going to set my eyelets in now. They're not in the way of any of my sewing, so I can't see why that's going to be a problem. So I'm going to put my eyelets in now, and I'm going to use my hand press with the punch tool and then the 8mm eyelet tool. Obviously, whichever, I will have mine linked down in the description down below, but whichever method you use for putting in your eyelets, you can certainly do yours now like I have. The other thing that I did was when I interfaced my pieces, I then folded them in half, wrong sides together, so that I got a nice creased edge there. So yes, I'm going to set my eyelets in, and then I can put this piece away. Okay, so I have my eyelets set into my front band. So the thing to note with this is to make sure that you have a mirrored pair. So you can see there's a slight slope and then seam allowance at the top of both of these, and then straight edge down there. So they are a mirrored pair. They are not two of exactly the same. So I'm going to set these aside for now and move on to step 1, which is to reinforce the corners of where the band is going to go in and then clip up to the small circles. So I'm going to get those marked onto my pattern piece, put a pin through, use my marking tool to mark it, and then I'm going to sew along there and up there, and then clip into that small corner there. And I'm going to make sure that all of my other notches are marked onto this pattern piece as well. So I have the pin in again to denote the right side of my fabric, because again I'm working with a fabric that the right side and the wrong side are basically the same. So I've reinforced these corners up to the small circle that I have put a mark in on the wrong side of the fabric. So now I need to snip up to but not through that stitching, and I am in a very awkward angle to do that with you guys, so let's move you a bit. Here we go, that's better. So let's see, I've got to try do this on camera. So you want to make sure that you're snipping right up to but not through your stitching, and this is where it helps when you have scissors that are sharp to the point, unlike these ones. And then I'm going to do the same for the other side. I'm going to do that off camera, and then we can attach our front bands. So after clipping up to our small circles, we can move on to step number 4, which is to interface the front band. Done that. Wrong sides together, fold front band along, fold line, press and baste. Now I have pressed, I haven't basted, but because I've put my eyelets in, this isn't going anywhere. So the next thing that we want to do is sew the front band sections to front, matching symbols, stitch, ending at small circle as shown. Stitch again at 1/4 inch, 6mm away in seam allowance, trim close to stitching. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remark on my little marks because they have come off, and I am going to stitch at the 5/8 inch seam allowance on my sewing machine. I'm then going to finish off the bottom on my sewing machine. I'm then going to take it over to the overlocker to finish off the raw edges and also trim off the excess, that as it says here, so trim close to stitching. So I'm going to pin it right sides together first, and do make sure you get the right side. So this is the right side and that's the wrong side. So I'm going to pin it together first, and I'll show you how I'm going to stitch it in. So I have the right side of the top front facing up. I have the right side of my eyelets facing the right side of the top front. So this is the wrong side that you can see of both of my front bands. And I have made sure to match up the marking, the small dot here, with the small dot that we sewed around and clipped up to on the front. So I'm going to stitch down both of these at 5/8 inch, back stitching at the beginning and the end. I'm going to do that for both sides, which we can then turn to the inside so that we can pin the bottom together and sew that, and then I can overlock. Okay, so we're looking at the back here, and hopefully you can see I have sewn 5/8 inch all the way up to that reinforced point that we made earlier. We made sure to keep this all nice and flat around this area and keep this out of the way. So we're now going to flip those bands into the center so that we can sew them to this piece. So if you can see, I'm going to turn those front bands in and around, and we want to match up the edges on here, make sure everything's lying nice and flat. I'm going to pin that in place. Now I haven't trimmed or pressed anything as yet because, as you know, I want to finish this on my overlocker. So I'm going to do this step first, and then I'm going to do all the trimming and pressing, because the trimming will happen on the overlocker. And I'm making sure that those front bands meet nice and snugly in the middle. So basically what I'm doing now is I'm basting but in place with my sewing machine, but that's because I have more precision with my sewing machine than I do with my overlocker. But I like how the overlocker looks. It's going to finish off all the raw edges. I mean, this technically is a knit fabric, so it will ravel, but it is unlikely to. It definitely doesn't fray, but it unravels. So I'm going to finish everything I can off on my overlocker. So I'm trying to pin through an eyelet. I have this into place. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch from this side, and I'm going to stitch from that reinforced point there, back stitch, to this reinforced point here and back stitch, and that will then mean that this front band is in place and I can finish off all of these edges on the overlocker. I've not pressed this yet, but this is what we want to end up with a nice sharp corner sewn in there. And as I say, I've not pressed or trimmed anything yet, so it does look a little puckered. But when I give this a nice press, I should end up with a nice join, and this is what it looks like from the back. So I'm going to use my overlocker to trim off this excess of all of these to finish off those raw edges. When you've pressed it, you should end up with something that looks like this from the front, and then will look like that at the back. And I have just pulled the threads and knotted them at the end of each of these. So I did the long ones first, and then I did the short one. Kind of went a bit wavy on the bottom there, but we'll ignore that. So yeah, I did the short one last and then tied off each of these ends. If you're not sure about the knots, you can always use a little bit of fray check on the knots just to make sure that that stays in place. So the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to stitch the back and the front together at the shoulders, and again I'm going to do that with my overlocker. Okay, so I have my front pinned to my back, right sides together along the shoulders, and I'm going to sew into the neckline with my overlocker at 5/8 of an inch to sew both of those seams closed. Okay, so my front and back are attached at the shoulders. I have pressed the shoulder seam towards the back, and I have stay stitched the neckline the whole way around at 1/2 inch. So we're going to set this to the side for now and work on the hood, which you can just see there. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do with the hood is sew the two sections together at the centre back, and we're going to press the seam towards the left hand side, and then we're going to top stitch the left hand side, so top stitching that seam allowance down. I have sewn my hood together at 5/8 of an inch along the centre back seam, and then I have turned it round and I have top stitched the seam allowance over to the left of the hood, and now I need to finish the front edge of the hood. So the pattern wants us to turn in front opening edge of hood along fold line, turning in 1/4 of an inch, 6mm on raw edge, press and baste. What I'm going to do is I am going to finish off the front edge of the hood with my overlocker, because that will give me an even 1/4 of an inch which I can turn under. I'm then going to mark on the fold line from the pattern and turn it under by that much as well, and that way we'll have a nicely finished edge that I can top stitch. Okay, so I have overlocked the raw front edge of my hood so that I can press that under by 1/4 of an inch. This is the fold line, which is 1.5 inches away from the raw edge. So I've also marked in 3-inch line, because if I fold this under and then if I fold again to meet that 3-inch line that I have drawn there, I am creasing along the fold line here. So I'm going to do that the whole way around, and then I'm going to top stitch that edge closed. Okay, so it's all pressed in place. I'm going to go and pin it down and then top stitch this edge down so I finish the hood. I'm top stitching it in place using my usual method. So I have my blind hem foot on because of the guide. I've got my needle moved all the way over to the left. running the guide along that folded edge there and top stitching it down. Okay, so if you're reading the pattern instructions, you'll notice I haven't done step 14. I haven't pinned back to front at size, adjusted, eased, based and stitch, because I like to put my sleeves in flat, and after I've put my hood in, that's going to be the next thing that I do. So I have finished off my hood. It's all nicely top stitched. So the next thing that I'm going to do is put the hood in. So pin hood to neck edge of garment, matching centres, clipping neck edge where necessary, based, stitch, stitch again, 1/4 inch, 6mm away in seam allowance, trim close to stitching, press seam towards hood. So I'm going to pin mine in place and I'm going to sew it on my overlocker. Okay, so I have the hood sewn on and I have finished the ends in the same manner that I've done previously. So I've pulled the thread through, threaded it onto a needle, sewn it back through on itself, and then I'm going to clip off this excess, and that's that finished. So the next thing it wants us to do is top stitch the neck edge of the hood, and we need to press seam towards the hood, and then we're going to sew all the way around the hood. And you'll have noticed I haven't added the detailing to the shoulder. I didn't want to do that with this one, I just wanted to add it to the sleeve. So I'm going to press this seam towards the hood, top stitch that in place, and then we can move on to working on the sleeve. Okay, so it wants us to place our trim centered over the sleeve. So I'm going to show you how I am going to put some markings in so that, fingers crossed, my trim is centered over the sleeve. I'll show you what I mean. I have marked on the front or the right side of my sleeve, and then I have taken the sleeve pattern and I have used this line, which is the trim line, to make a notch at the top and then a notch at the bottom. And you need to make sure that you get the right notch at the bottom, because there is a notch for putting on the cuff. So this is actually a sleeve, this sleeve, that folded that way. So there's the notch for the cuff, there's the notch for the trim. I've drawn a line from notch to notch down the centre of my pattern piece, and then the trim that I'm using is 7/8 of an inch wide. So I have marked lines evenly spaced either side of that so that I know where my trim needs to go, and I am going to sew that on with my edge stitch foot down one side and then the other to get that perfectly in position. So I have done all the work for one sleeve. I'm going to do it for the other, repeat for the other, and make sure again that I'm doing it on the right side. And sleeves is another important one that you want to make sure, if your fabric is not obvious which is the right and wrong side, that you make sure that you end up with mirrors of each other, not a exact copy. So I've got my front notch there and my back notches here, so when I do the other one, if I've marked the right side of my fabric, I should have the front notch there and the back notches there. And again, I'll show you what I mean when we get there. So I did mark on the front of my sleeve, and as you can see I have the double notch on this side this time, and then the single notch at the front, which means that I am making a mirrored pair of each other. So I've drawn on the trim line, and then I have made the marks for the 7/8 of an inch wide so that I can centre my trim on and sew it down. So I'm going to get that done next. I have my trim sewn on, and again I use my blind hem foot in my usual manner, needle over to the left, guide against the edge of the trim and just sew. This has not been pressed yet. I am going to go give that a press now, and then we can get our sleeves into our top. So I have pinned my sleeve to the right side of my top, so right sides together. I've matched up the edges, matched up the single notch, I matched up the shoulder seam with the centre of the sleeve, I've matched up the double notch, and I've matched up this edge, and then I've eased in the fullness because the sleeve cap is bigger than the armscye. So I am going to sew this on my overlocker at 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to be stretching the bottom part, so the body of the jumper, to match up with the fullness of the sleeve. If you don't feel confident about doing that on your overlocker, because that is a lot of unpicking if it goes wrong, and also you're cutting off your seam allowance, do this on your sewing machine first and then go over it with your overlocker once you're happy that your sleeve is set in the way you want it to be. So I'm going to sew this at 5/8 of an inch on my overlocker. I'm going to do the same for the other sleeve, and then we can sew up the side seams. Okay, so now that the sleeves are nicely sewn in and they are all there's no puckers or anything in there. I am going to pin up the side seams, and I'm going to sew those at 5/8 an inch from the bottom of the waist right to the wrist, and then I can add the cuffs and the waistband and we will be done almost, because I've got to add the string as well. Okay, so we're starting to get something that resembles a jumper, which is awesome. So I have sewn up the side seams and I am going to reach through and turn it through so that we can start working on the cuffs and the waistband. So it's definitely starting to look like a hoodie, and it's going to be really nice actually when that's all laced up. I have some grey cord for that, and then I've got the trim on the sleeves as well, which is going to match the trousers. So we're going to start working on the cuffs. So you want to double check that you've got all of your notches marked, which I have. Notches. Yes, all of my notches are marked. So I'm going to do the same thing that I've been doing for the entire garment. I'm going to put a pin in the right side of both of these, and then I'm going to go and press it wrong sides together so that I have that cuff crease line in there already before I sew it together on the overlocker. And that's only because it's much easier to press something that's flat than it is to press something that's in the round, especially when it's cuff size and quite small. So I'm going to take it off the pattern, mark the right sides, wrong sides together, press it lengthways like that, so we end up with a piece that's around about that size, and then we can sew the short ends together. Okay, so I'm not using ribbing because again I didn't have one that I liked enough that matched this well enough that I had enough of, so I'm using the same type of fabric again. As I say, I have pressed it wrong sides together, and I can tell that because I've marked the right side with a pin so that I have a crease. What I'm going to do now is pin it right sides together, and I'm going to sew along this short edge, and I'm actually going to only sew that at 1/4 inch because I think this is going to be quite a tight fit, and I actually prefer my cuffs to be a little bit looser. So I'm going to sew both of these at 1/4 inch right sides together to then attach them to the sleeves. Okay, so when you've sewn the cuff together, what you want to do is turn it so that the wrong sides are together, and you kind of want to twist the seam at the fold point so that you are putting one lot of seam allowance one way and one lot of seam allowance the other way, so you're nesting your seam allowance again. And if you just twist it at that fold point, I find that that works really well for me. So I am going to pin this the whole way around so that the raw edges are even, so that I can then pin it into my top. And if we look, there should be, yep, there's my other notch. And then if we bring that notch together with the back seam, I'm then going to put pins in at those 1/4 points as well. And again, through the viewfinder, always fun. And I'm going to repeat this with the other cuff. Okay, so I have my sleeve here and I have my cuff. I've got the seam of the cuff, and that's going to go to the seam on the sleeve. So I've got my hand through my cuff and I'm going to post my sleeve through that, and going to pin everything in place. So I'm going to start with the back seam, then we've got the notch at the front here, so, and it's not the one that's the center of your trim, it's the one just off center of your trim. So I'm going to match that up, and then I want to pin in the rest of my sleeve, easing it in. So I'm going to pull the sleeve taut as I can, and then use that pin to put that in place. And then I'm going to do the same for the other side. Pull the two, the front and the back seam as tight as possible so that the sleeve is taut against the cuff, and then pin that into place. So there is some excess here, so I'm going to sew this on my overlocker at 5/8 inch, and I'm going to want to make sure that I'm pulling everything nice and taut as I am sewing, and making sure that all the raw edges are matching up to make sure that I don't get any puckers when I am sewing that seam. Okay, so the cuffs are on. I'm going to finish the thread tails in the same manner that I have been for the rest of the project. So pull the threads taut, thread them onto a wide-eyed needle. You want to thread it back through itself for about an inch and a half. Pull that through, trim off the excess, and that's your thread buried. So I'm gonna definitely need to get myself a thimble. I promise this is usually easier than this. There we go. So I've pulled that through, trim off the excess, and that's the cuff done. So we're going to press the seam towards the sleeve, and then the cuffs are done, so we can then move on to the waistband. I want to do the same thing for the waistband. I have marked the right sides with my pins. I'm now going to go and press that lengthways, and I am going to press it wrong sides together to give myself a crease. I'm going to sew the short sides together and then attach it to the jumper. Okay, so I have pressed it wrong sides together, so I have the crease, and I'm now going to sew the two short ends together at 5/8 of an inch, and I've got those both pinned in. We can then get it attached to our top. When we're turning our waistband back to be wrong sides together, you want to do the same thing. You want to kind of twist your overlocking seam allowance so that you nest those seams together. So I've got this one going over to the right, and then this one's going over to the left. And that means, well, there's less bulk in your top when you sew this together. When you give your garment your final press, that'll kind of like neaten out. So I'm going to do the same for the other side. So I'm going to have that one that way, that one that way. So the one on the top is going to the left, the one underneath is going to the right. Pin that in place. Then there are notches on the front and the back of this one, so I'm going to make sure that they match up, and this will help us get the waistband position nicely on the top. Now I can take out my pin for the right side because we know which is the right side now, and the same when I get around to here, because I have been stabbing myself with them this entire time, but now we've got it looking like this, we know which is the right side. So that is all pinned. So I am now going to match up these side seams and these notches on the top and get this pinned into place. Okay, so I have my waistband pinned in, so I am going to need to stretch it to fit in. So we're going to do the same thing that we did with the cuffs. Stretch the waistband, find kind of the rough centre point and pin, and then just make sure when you are sewing this in that you are pulling the excess taut so that the raw edges meet up nicely. I'm going to sew this on my overlocker at 5/8 of an inch, and once we've done that I'm going to press the seam towards the garment and we can thread in our cord. Okay, so the last thing you want to do is thread through your cording. I have used 45 inches because I didn't want to have my cords be too long, and I don't intend to ever wear this tied up. Now that I have it threaded through my eyelets, I need to finish it off. So I have these cord ends, and I am going to thread the cording through, and then I am going to tie it in a knot. And as you can see, this stuff frays like nobody's business. I'm going to tie this in a knot, a nice tight knot, which, fingers crossed, this shouldn't go over, which could possibly, so I might try to tie another knot there. And then I am going to use some fray check on the end of my cord to make sure that it doesn't come undone, and yeah, I think that's going to be good. Yeah, that's nice. So I am going to trim off this excess fluffy bit and use some fray check. Doing this in the viewfinder, always interesting. Cut off all the fluff, fray check. You could also use super glue. You really want to make sure that that is not going to come undone and unravel and fray like this. So I'm going to do the same for the other side, and then we're done. As ever, if you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comment section down below and I will do my best to answer them for you. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!